This is the Digging for Truth podcast, presented by the Associates for Biblical Research, demonstrating the historical reliability of the Bible through archaeological and biblical research.
Josephus is probably one of the most well-known ancient historians, at least to Christians, and it's because he describes in great detail the history of the Jews and a lot of the first century AD events, including a brief description about Jesus. That paragraph about Jesus is a debated passage among scholars because it appears to affirm what's in the New Testament, but from a Jew who probably wouldn't have said those things, so that means Christians must have changed the original writing at some point, right? Well, Dr. Thomas Schmidt, a Christian scholar specializing in the historical Jesus, the early church, and Christianity in the East, has done extensive research on this particular passage and wrote a book about his findings called Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. Dr. Schmidt was also a guest on Digging for Truth TV, and he joins us again today.
Tom, welcome to Digging for Truth podcast.
Henry, I'm delighted to be back with you.
Yeah, thanks. Well, we had some fun together. For folks who want to sort of listen to this podcast and then supplement it with our interview that you and I did for Digging for Truth TV with visual aids, they can kind of use them as a complement. We're going to talk about some of the things we talked about in the show, but we'll probably talk about other things that we didn't have time to cover. So hopefully these two will complement each other. So friends, we ask you to check that out. Now, before we dive in, Tom, maybe we thought, give us a little mini biography of your ministry work, your academic work, and how you got interested maybe in the subject of Josephus.
I'm a Christian first and foremost. I was in college. I became a Christian in college. I started studying Latin and Greek. I wanted to do everything I could to read the Bible in the original language of Greek, and so I majored in Latin and Greek. And I was thinking at the time of being either a minister, a pastor, a missionary, or a scholar. And the Lord led me to scholarship. I received my PhD from Yale University, where I studied ancient Christianity. And that included New Testament, early Christian writings, and also something I was particularly fascinated in was Eastern Christianity in Central Asia and Persia, the Middle East. So I've done some studies on those areas also. I am a professor at Fairfield University. This year, I am a visiting fellow at Princeton University, and my research areas focus on my interests, on the historical Jesus, on the New Testament, but also early Christian writings and Eastern Christianity also. And this book that we're here to talk about today, in some sense, draws from all those fields, because though it's about Jesus, I also spend much time talking about early Christian reception of this passage that Josephus wrote about Jesus. And I also draw from Eastern manuscripts for Syriac and Arabic texts and versions of Josephus's passage, which, as it turns out, are actually crucial in establishing the text of the passage.
Excellent. That's great. It's interesting. I probably mentioned this to you before, but when you and I first started corresponding, I was like, your name sounded so familiar. And then I remembered that you had co-authored a book on Hippolytus of Rome, or some say Hippolytus. I say Hippolytus, potato. And I was like, then it clicked because I was doing research on Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies and, that kind of thing. So it felt like a small world in a way for me. It was like, oh yeah. I remember that. So that's a lot of great stuff. There's probably not a lot of people that, as they're going in their early academic days, realize they want to study Greek and Latin. So we're glad that we have specialists like you that have the passion for it and have a calling, right? Someone has to do that work. So Josephus. Let's maybe introduce Josephus, maybe a little Josephus 101, if you will, before we dive into the particulars of his writings and his references to Jesus. Give us a little tutorial on this famous Jewish historian.
Most people know Josephus as an ancient writer who wrote history, and that's true. But Josephus was many other things also. He was born in Jerusalem in the 30s AD. He was born to an eminent priestly family. a family descending from high priests and kings also. So Josephus was an aristocrat. He received a superb education. When he was 16, he tells us that he began a multi-year investigation of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And at age 19, he became a Pharisee. Some scholars will say instead of becoming a Pharisee, he only began obeying Pharisaic law. Either way, he was very, very familiar with the Pharisees. At age 20, he became a priest. He began serving in the Jewish temple. This would have been around 57, 58 AD. And then when he was 25, his stature was of such heights that he was nominated to be an ambassador and to travel to Rome to meet with the Empress of Rome herself, which he did. And then returning to Rome, or returning to Jerusalem, that is, a few years later, war was afoot with the Romans. This was the beginning of the Jewish war with Rome, and starting around 68 or so AD. And Josephus was again nominated to be one of 7 generals in the Jewish war with Rome. And this was a political as much as military appointment. He was designated not only to be the general in Galilee, but to be the governor, the ruler of Galilee. So he stayed in Galilee for some months, gathered an army, he says, of 100,000 men, visited all sorts of villages. Eventually, the Jews, of course, were defeated. Josephus was captured by the Romans. But, in an unbelievable maneuver, Josephus goes from being prisoner to being acquaintances with the emperor of Rome, Vespasian. And he receives his patronage, and he's allowed to settle in Rome, where he devotes the remaining 20 or 25 years of his life to writing the history of the Jewish people. He wrote about 500,000 words in Greek in 4 major books. And these books form, I think, the most important extra-biblical witnesses we have to the New Testament times. He tells us all sorts of things about New Testament people, places, events, customs, things like that. The names of New Testament personages just flow from his pages. He talks about Herod Agrippa, Herod the Great, Herodias, Pontius Pilate, the high priest Caiaphas, the high priest Annas, Rabbi Gamaliel. He mentions, the taxation issue that Jesus is questioned about in the Gospels, and so on and so forth. So he is extremely valuable for understanding the New Testament. And he also mentions people like John the Baptist, James, the brother of Jesus, and of course, he also mentions Jesus himself. And the passage, what he says about Jesus, is what my book is about.
Excellent. Yeah, just from that overarching sketch, talk about crossing paths in history with, the early church, right? It's extraordinary. I've always seen this as so extraordinary in the providence and the sovereignty of God that, first of all, that the Romans just didn't kill him. Right? You said that yourself. They went to Rome. He ends up rubbing elbows with the emperor, as it were. It's a remarkable story. What a life, right? You hear stories about people, biographies you watch on TV about extraordinary lives. Well, Josephus certainly would qualify in that category. Now, a little bit later in our podcast, we're gonna go back to some of this biography, because this is going to be how he intersects with people that were involved in the trial of Jesus. So I'm going to leave that there, right, for the moment. We'll return to it. So we have this very controversial reference in Josephus referring to Jesus. Many people know about it, perhaps some don't. So let's explore that together. What's it called? What's this passage called? It's got a fancy scholarly name attached to it, right, Tom? And
yes.
So give us some tutorial on that.
In Josephus's book called The Antiquities, this was a history of the Jewish people from the beginning up until about 65, 66 AD. And of course, in this work, Josephus talks about the governorship of Pontius Pilate, which was extremely controversial. Pontius Pilate did a lot of nasty things. In Josephus's discussion of Pontius Pilate, he mentions several disturbances that occurred during his governorship. And one of these is a passage, is about 90 words, about Jesus, who was the progenitor of the Christians. And Josephus, perhaps I'll read the passage according to how it has normally been translated by scholars. It goes like this. And in this time there was a certain Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was a doer of incredible deeds, or miracles, you could say. A teacher of men who received truisms or truths with pleasure. And he brought over many from among the Jews and many from among the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when Pilate had condemned him to the cross at the accusation of the first men among us, those who loved him at first did not cease to do so, for on the third day he appeared to them alive again. The divine prophets having spoken such things and thousands of other wonderful things about him. And up till now, the tribe of the Christians who were named from him has not disappeared. Now, it's a short passage, but it does tell us a lot about Jesus. There's a problem, though. Traditionally, scholars have been very skeptical that Josephus actually wrote these words about Jesus. And that's because in the passage, Josephus says several things that are unlikely or impossible for a non-Christian Jew to have said about Jesus. Some of these are that he calls Jesus the Christ. He apparently says he was the Christ. He says he fulfilled Jewish prophecy, that he was raised from the dead after 3 days. He says he worked miracles. Some of these are very unlikely for him to have said. Some of them, like I said, are impossible. So traditionally, scholars have been very, very wary of being able to use this passage to learn about the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth, because they think that Josephus either wrote something about Jesus that was later contaminated or corrupted by a Christian scribe, or some Christian scribe realized that in the reign of Pontius Pilate, Josephus didn't say anything about Jesus. So a scribe just inserted this paragraph wholesale. And my book analyzes this argument and looks to see, is this true? Did Josephus really say these things? Have there been changes? I go through all the evidence and I conclude that actually, I think he did say this, except I think that the passage has been over-translated. I don't think it's quite as positive about Jesus as scholars have assumed. And so what that means is that the passage is authentic, but it's more ambiguous than how scholars have traditionally translated it.
Excellent. So we should mention, I should have mentioned earlier, but I will mention here, your website, josephusandjesus.com. And because an anonymous major donor made a major donation towards the book, people can actually download this book for free. And so we want to encourage you to check that out. All the details of what Tom is going to talk about on our episode here are found in his book. We, of course, want to encourage you, if you're willing and able, to purchase the book. But if that's not viable, the next best thing is the download. The thing I love about it is you can do an overview of the book. If you have particular areas you want to dive into, it's got hundreds of footnotes with sources and more material and appendices. So there's a little side commercial there, Tom. But I don't want to get off track. We do want to encourage people to do that. So before I encountered your work and we became acquainted with each other, I always, just assumed that this positive interpretation of the underlying Greek text was, in fact, just what it was. Like, for example, the phrase, he was the Christ. Okay, so now a person who says that, like, he was the Christ, that seems like a confession of faith.
It does, yes.
Right. I mean, that's what, in English, that's what it appears as. Let's explore that one together, because that's there's a lot of important things here, but this is a key one. Tell us about that translation, maybe the manuscripts, and your alternative proposal of how that should be translated into English, because that's really important.
That, I think, is probably the most crucial, certainly one of the most crucial pivot points in whether this passage should be taken as authentic or not. And you're right, in English, the phrase, he was the Christ, feels like a confession of faith. And that would mean that Josephus must have been a Christian, even though we know he was not. We know that he was a Jewish non-Christian. So there's some things to observe here. One is that Josephus doesn't say Jesus is the Christ. He says he was the Christ. And that's strange coming from a Christian. Christians say that Jesus is the Christ because he is still alive. It's a very important belief in Christianity.
Or
perhaps the most important one.
Right? Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Lord is a version of that, right?
Exactly. Yes. And when we look at Greek databases, there are some fabulous Greek databases out there that one of them in particular collects almost all the ancient Greek writings ever written before, the printing press. And so you can do some comprehensive searches. And if you look for, do Christian writers ever use the phrase, he was the Christ? And the answer, as far as I could tell, is no, that they say he is the Christ. So that's odd. You would think if a Christian was going to change what Josephus said, that this scribe would have changed the was into an is.
Yes.
But so that's just a little interesting little nugget there that makes you pause and wonder if something more is going on here than we imagine. Another thing to observe is that though in English the phrase he was the Christ sounds like a confession of faith, in Greek it is not as clear. Greek will often put the definite article, which is just the word for the. They will put the before names, before proper names. So I would be the Tom in Greek. So the phrase he was the Christ is in Greek a lot easier to read and understand as just being a name, an alternative name for Jesus. People do that today, where people will use the word Christ like a name, like Jesus' last name, Jesus Christ.
Yes, yeah.
And people did that in the ancient world too. We have examples of non-Christians calling Jesus Christ because they're just using it as a name, not as a confession of faith. So it's possible that Josephus simply was using this as a name. That also explains why he used the past tense. And this seems to be how many Christians understood the passage. We have many examples of ancient Christians who quote Josephus's passage, and they don't seem to think Josephus was a Christian. They don't seem to have read this passage as a confession of faith in Christ. They seem to have read it as a name. So that's one possibility of how to interpret the passage. But in my book, though, I argue for a second possibility, which I think is even more plausible. And this is because we do have some ancient translations of the passage. We have an ancient Latin and an ancient Syriac translation of the passage. The Syriac is an Eastern language similar to Hebrew, similar to Aramaic. And both of those translations, in this point, do not say Jesus was the Christ. They say something different. The Latin translation says he was believed to be the Christ, and the Syriac says he was thought to be the Christ. What I argue is that I think that the ancient Latin and Syriac translators, working independently of each other, each had a variant. They had a different Greek reading there where Josephus didn't say he was the Christ. He said he was thought to be or believed to be or something along those lines. And this matches Josephus's terms for Jesus because Josephus does speak about Jesus in one other location, a very, very brief reference, where he mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ. So in this second reference, Josephus doesn't say Jesus was the Christ. He says he was called the Christ, and that seems to parallel the Latin and Syriac translations of the longer passage. I hypothesize, therefore, that that's what Josephus originally wrote, and that a Greek word or two has dropped out, probably unintentionally, because the remarkable thing is that later Christians keep reading the passage as if this is just another term for another name or something. Like it doesn't substantively appear to alter the meaning from the point of view of Greek speakers. Of course, in English translation, it does look shocking to us, but
yes.
The original, though, I think would have been very clear that Jesus was considered to be the Christ.
Yeah, I thought that was helpful too, just instructive from the standpoint of people living not that we obviously can't get at the true meaning of a Greek text living in the 21st century. Obviously, we can do that. But people living closer to the events and maybe more familiar with the language in terms of, antiquity, late antiquity, or the medieval period, of understanding it better. And what I thought was a powerful piece of evidence is the understanding in two translation traditions that are independent of one another, right? That often is, so there's not a collaboration or groupthink going on in that, right? Now, do I remember right also that Jerome interpreted the passage that way, or am I thinking of something else?
Oh, you're right. He actually was the Latin translator.
Oh, okay. Okay. Right.
So I should have mentioned that these translations come from extremely eminent translators. Jerome,
yes.
One of the great translators of the ancient world, and then the Syriac came from a gentleman named Jacob of Edessa, who arguably was the most educated man in the world at the time. He was highly educated, very accomplished translator. So these are not, bums off the street translating this passage. They are the best of the best of the best.
Yes, very good. Thanks for correcting me on that. It slipped my mind. I thought Jerome was the third witness, but he's the Latin witness, and that makes a lot of sense. And we should add Jerome translated the Hebrew Bible into the Latin Vulgate, consulted with the rabbis, lived in Bethlehem. I mean, his translation of the Old Testament into Latin is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of the church. So not that he was infallible, but there is something to be said for his understanding of the passage.
Yes,
I think it's just a very powerful piece of evidence. It's not the whole thing, but it's part of the matrix, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
Precisely.
the point of the book is you're bringing all of this information together. So you lay out in the book sort of three possibilities of how the passage could be read. You say negative, neutral, or positive. So the positive is he was the Christ. The neutral is he was believed to be the Christ, and in the negative, and there's others there, he was thought to be the Christ, which in and of itself is not necessarily negative either. It's like, hey, these people thought he was the Messiah.
Right.
And the inference seems to be there, but I don't.
Yes.
Right? I mean,
Yes.
That's kind of the logic of the phraseology. It changes the meaning of everything, which obviously not the meaning of everything. It's so crucial to the whole understanding of what Josephus is getting at here.
Yes, and what it means is that the next part of the passage where Josephus allegedly says that after 3 days Jesus appeared to the disciples alive again, that contradicts what he said earlier, that Jesus only was the Christ or was thought to be, meaning he's not around anymore, he's dead. And that's something that I show is that phrase that is traditionally translated as Josephus confessing the resurrection when he says, after his crucifixion, 3 days later, he appeared alive again. I show that the key Greek word appear, which in Greek is phainomai or phaino, that also can just mean seem. He seemed to them to be alive again, meaning that Josephus is casting this as the belief of the disciples, not his own belief. And that makes sense of why he used the past tense for Jesus as the Christ, that he was only thought to be the Christ. Josephus doesn't actually think he was the Christ, doesn't think he was raised from the dead. And you put all this together, and the passage comes across much more ambiguous. It comes across as Josephus giving an account of this miracle worker. He does think Jesus did supernatural deeds, but the word he uses for miracles is not the most positive word for miracles in the Greek language. Greek has several words for miracles, but Josephus uses the word paradoxa, which is, used for a good English translation of it would be like paranormal deeds, something that is supernatural, but Josephus isn't sure where this power is coming from. This matches the accusations against Jesus by Jewish leaders in the Gospels, where they accuse Jesus of performing miracles by demonic sources, by Beelzebul, by the finger of Beelzebul. And Josephus seems to be picking up on that, where he can't deny the miracles. He can't deny that they didn't occur, but he wants to come up with some other explanation for them. You put all that together and you re-render the passage, and it sounds much more Josephine. It sounds much more like a first century Jew, non-Christian Jew would have said about Jesus. And what that means is that all of the objections to the authenticity of the passage that come from scholars are answered. The objections are that the passage makes claims a first century Jew would not have said, but I think properly understood, the passage actually sounds very much like a first century Jew. And then some other objections are that the passage doesn't follow the style of Josephus. It's written in a different style. I show in my book that every single phrase in the passage has parallels elsewhere in Josephus's works. It actually sounds remarkably like Josephus. And I even show this statistically, where I show that the frequency rate of common words and rare words matches the same frequency rate that we find in Josephus's works. These are not things that ancient scholars and ancient scribes could have realized if they were making up a passage or doctoring a passage. We only know these things about frequency rates because we have databases today and we can count these numbers. And so these are powerful arguments that Josephus is behind this passage.
Yeah, and I should mention that what you just survey there is all laid out in the book in detail and footnoted, and you give all the data. You bring the goods, as it were. So, which is what you need to do, especially with an argument like this, where you're kind of going against the academic consensus. It really makes you sharpen the pencil, as it were, right? You gotta try to turn over every stone. Which it feels like, I'm not an expert in this area, but when I read through the book, it's like, man, this is a powerful sort of web of data that sort of converges together. How do you ultimately understand this? What's the best understanding of all this information? Yeah, this Greek word here, there's a spectrum of meaning that can be used. And we experience this in everyday life in English. We don't think much about it, the way that we use language, right? And again, in that standard English translation, miraculous deeds, my brain, when I read that, goes to divine power, positive, as presented in the Gospels.
Precisely.
It's understandable sort of superficially how your mind would go there, right? That makes sense on the surface until you dig deeper. Because if you put the word magical instead of miraculous, that brings a whole other dimension.
Right.
And you also point out, I knew this before too, the accusation of Jesus being under influence of demonic forces. I mean, this finds its way into the Talmud later. So this is clearly something that is along the line. So it seems like, if your understanding is correct, Josephus is carrying on something that originated in the New Testament. He's making the statement about it in his own context, and that continues on in the Talmud several centuries later. Is that a good understanding of that?
Yes, precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely. And it's not just the Talmud. If we read other early Jewish accounts of Jesus, there's a source called the Jew of Celsus, which is 2nd century. He says the same thing that Josephus does. In fact, Celsus, who quotes the Jew of Celsus, he uses the same word. He says that Jesus performed paradoxa, and he's trying to accuse Jesus of using sorcery. We find the same thing in a document called the Toldoth Yeshu, which is this very hostile anti-Christian biography of Jesus written in Jewish circles. And they say the same thing about Jesus. Josephus seems to be picking up on this. And of course, these accusations go back to the time of the Gospels themselves, where these accusations are recorded in the Gospels we have today. So they clearly were contemporary with Jesus. In that sense, these are powerful witnesses that non-Christians were not able to dismiss the miracles of Jesus. Instead, they had to explain how Jesus did these miracles, yet was not a good, benevolent figure. And so no, people shouldn't follow him. And of course, what they came up with is that he must be doing sorcery. He must be under the influence of demons. And Christians rightly responded to that by saying, how could someone who is doing sorcery call for people to repent of their sins and worship God? How could someone who's under the influence of sorcery do so many wonderful things like heal the sick and give sight to the blind and lay his life down for sinners and teach these profound teachings about loving your neighbor, loving your enemies, loving God first of all? These are not things that come from demonic sources.
Yeah, that's very good. It's interesting, right? Think of house divided against itself cannot stand, which is what Jesus says, right? I mean, there it is, right at the beginning, and you see it on. I was thinking of Justin Martyr too, who reports that the rabbis were going out throughout the diaspora to try to oppose the preaching of the resurrection. And explaining that the disciples stole the body. So there's this whole sort of network of opposition that's there, right? And now Justin doesn't particularly mention I don't remember if he remembers the works, the miracles or not. But the point is, it's kind of all consistent with the other data that we have as well. So, I thought just really, really helpful. When you reference the resurrection part too, he appeared to them to be alive, or it seemed to them he was alive, right? That's another one. Is it saying this is what the disciples claimed, which is what your argument is? And it's interesting because they loved him and were devoted to him. So this idea of this explains their devotion in a sense, right? The belief in the resurrection. But Josephus isn't speaking for himself. But again, like I've interpreted that passage that way, superficially. It's not, I wouldn't say misleading. That's way too strong of a word, but it just shows you how you can absorb ideas and not even know that you have absorbed a whole bunch of assumptions if you haven't dug into it. I really, it just reminded me once again is you got to do your homework.
I agree. And what's interesting about that resurrection passage is that Josephus is placing this belief in the resurrection in the mind of the disciples. It seemed to them that he was alive again after 3 days, says Josephus. What's remarkable about that is that skeptical scholars for years, even generations now, have deployed arguments that not only was Jesus not resurrected, but that the early disciples didn't even believe he was resurrected. And the remarkable thing about what Josephus says is that he affirms that the disciples did believe this. They did believe this. And he appears to place this belief on the third day. And not only did they believe it, they did not believe in some kind of symbolic or spiritual resurrection. They thought he really was alive in the flesh again, because Josephus says it seemed to them that he was alive again. And of course, if the belief Josephus is talking about is just one of a spiritual Jesus in heaven alone, he wouldn't be alive again. His spirit never would have died to begin with. And so what this does is it shows that Josephus is affirming the very, very early belief that Jesus rose bodily from the grave after 3 days. This was not something that was concocted generations later. It was something that the original disciples themselves believed, apparently on the third day.
Yeah, that's great. Do I recall correctly that you get into the details on the phraseology about the third day, where it in Josephus it's written differently than where most Christians, the church fathers, and so on would write? Is that right? And okay, good, I got that right. So tell us a little bit about that.
That's another, I come across so many instances like this where there's a phrase that in English, he appeared to them alive again on the third day. That phrase on the third day sounds like a stock Christian term. We're always running around saying Jesus was resurrected on the third day. However, in Greek, it's not so simple. Greek has many, many ways of saying on the third day. It can use just a simple dative. It can use various prepositions, but Josephus doesn't do any of that. He uses this kind of odd, awkward, paraphrastic phrase that literally reads, having the third day. So Jesus having the third day. This is a turn of phrase Josephus uses elsewhere, where he will talk about a time frame or a time within which by saying having the whatever number day or number amount of time, the third hour or whatever it is in Josephus. So one thing to observe is this is a very Josephan phrase. It sounds like Josephus. But the second thing is if you search using those databases I mentioned and you search for, did Christians ever, in all the millions of words we have in the first 3 centuries, did Christians ever talk about the resurrection of Jesus on the third day by using this term, by having the third day? And I searched for that, and as far as I can tell, no, they never did that. They always used one of the many other alternatives. So what this tells us is this is just a remarkable note of authenticity in this
Yes.
passage. This really sounds like Josephus. It does not sound like a Christian scribe. There are many, many examples of this in the phrases in the Testimonium. And part of the problem is our English translations, by just the nature of English, obscures these observations. But when you read it in Greek and you do the hard work of looking at databases, they start emerging. I could just list some other examples for you. One example is receive with pleasure. Josephus uses that term in the passage, receive with pleasure, which even in English does sound a little odd, but it turns out that Josephus loves that phrase. He uses it, 8, 9 other times. It's a very unusual phrase, but Josephus likes it. There's another one, the first men. Josephus will talk about the first men accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. Josephus uses that phrase, first men, dozens and dozens of other times. And it sounds very Josephian. The same with the word paradoxa, the same with the phrase that begins the passage. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Almost every single phrase you can say similar things about. So the passage just looks thoroughly Josephian, and I believe, therefore, should be accepted as thoroughly authentic.
Yeah. So it's not just the particular phraseologies that we highlighted already, like he was the Christ or he was believed to be the Christ, but it's just the syntax and the style and the vocabulary. Like you do all that analysis in the book, and then you give lots of sources in the footnotes and bibliography so people can check that out. And, reminded how blessed we are in the modern day to have this computer technology where we can collate all this data, all this Greek data. Because I would imagine, 100 years ago, if you're, the infamous Josephian scholar Henry St. John Thackeray, right? His work is still quite revered. I mean, he died almost 100 years ago. He probably had to do it the old-fashioned way, right? I mean, like
he did,
and which is really extraordinary when you think about these previous generation scholars, the work that they did that we benefit from. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to sidetrack. I have always found Thackeray's work to be immensely helpful. But anyway, it makes you appreciate what they had to do.
And I should add that there have been 3 academic reviews that have been already published regarding my book. This is lightning fast. The book came out this previous summer, 6 months ago, or even less in the United States. It only came out about 4 months ago. There's already been 3 academic reviews that have come out on the book, and they are very positive regarding my argument for the authenticity of this paragraph. The paragraph is often called the Testimonium Flavianum, the testimony of Flavius Josephus. And one of these reviews is by a revered Josephus scholar, Steve Mason. And he writes a 25-page review article of the book. And he says, he does have many critiques, but he says my arguments regarding the authenticity, in his words, seem, quote, strong. And the other 2 reviewers are similarly positive regarding my arguments for authenticity. In fact, not a single one of them has actually critiqued my arguments for authenticity in the sense of Josephus not having written these words. They will critique some of my interpretations of the words, but not that Josephus actually wrote the words.
Interesting.
There's many more reviews that are to come, so this is still early days. We can't, conclude how scholarship will take these arguments yet, but it is encouraging.
Yeah, that's good. And those more micro level critiques, you can pull the nuggets out of them, and when you do the second edition, you can improve upon it. Right? There's got to be a second edition,
yes. Right? I want to. Oh yes. I've got more stuff. I have more things I want to add.
Yeah, that's great. Well, then we'll have to do another podcast, Tom. I mean, it's just the way it has to be. Well, I appreciate that. So the first part of the book, part 1, on the whole, is really a discussion of this passage and some of the things that you talked about. We want to point people to also the fact of you go over the reception of this passage in Christendom, Origen, Eusebius, and so on. Maybe before we shift to part 2, maybe give us a little tutorial on that, however you want to describe it.
Yes, in two of my chapters, I try to do an exhaustive reception history where I look at every single instance that of a Greek writer quoting this Testimonium Flavianum, quoting this passage, in order to see how that Greek writer interprets the passage. They knew Greek better than we do, and I want to see if there's some tendencies. I also do the same thing for Latin and Syriac, and in one case, an Arabic writer who is quoting the passage, but they themselves either know Greek or they're using sources that knew Greek. I do that in a second chapter. And a very interesting pattern emerges where you would think that if the passage was unabashedly positive about Jesus, you would think that these Christian authors would celebrate the passage and would point out all of these fabulous pro-Christian things that Josephus says about Jesus, that he calls Jesus the Christ, he says he worked miracles, he rose from the dead, he fulfilled Jewish prophecy. He even questions his humanity when he says if it's fitting to call him a man, at least according to several interpretations of that aspect. But what I show is that again and again and again, the majority of Greek authors don't do that. They don't point out these fabulous pro-Christian aspects of the passage, even though they are quoting the passage in the same form we have it today. We know they have the same form. And what this tells me is that they're reading the passage differently. This is especially true because often they will quote Josephus's passage about John the Baptist, and Josephus discusses John the Baptist. He loves John the Baptist. He's very positive about John the Baptist, and they will point out the positive things that Josephus has to say about John the Baptist, but they don't do that often with Jesus. And this suggests that this reception history is just another argument that contemporary scholars have been misreading the passage as far too pro-Christian, because clearly ancient Christians tended to not read it this way. And also when you look at Josephus's usages of the same words and phrases in the passage elsewhere, he also doesn't seem to use those words and phrases in such openly positive senses. And together they make for a powerful argument that the passage has been misinterpreted.
Yeah, I thought that was really helpful. I mean, that whole section discusses these different authors. I mentioned Origen and Eusebius because they're early and they're Christian and they wrote a lot of material, right? So you get into that. I was thinking of Origen too. You know, like as soon as I started reading that, and it was like, well, you would think in contra Celsus, against Celsus, in an apologetic work, he would deploy that like as a battering ram, right? I mean, that would seem to be a very logical thing to do. If I recall correctly, he doesn't do that.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. One of the arguments against the authenticity of the Testimonium Flavianum, against this passage, has been that Origen never mentions it. Origen quotes from Josephus. He quotes from Book 18 of the Antiquities, exactly where the passage should be found. And you would think he would have used this passage, if it was positive, against his interlocutor. He's arguing against this very hostile critic of Christianity. And Origen doesn't deploy the passage. So scholars have, thought about this, and they've concluded that either the passage was negative originally, and Origen didn't want to quote from it because it was negative, or that the passage didn't exist. There was no such passage, which explains the silence of Origen. And what I show, though, is that, if the passage properly interpreted, as I suggest it should be, then Origen wouldn't have had really any reason to quote from the passage. In fact, he would have wanted to avoid it. And that's because for two reasons. One is that the passage says exactly what Celsus already believed. Celsus is the hostile interlocutor. Celsus would have said that the disciples thought Jesus was raised from the dead. He would have said that they thought Jesus fulfilled prophecy, that they considered him to be the Christ. I mean, none of this would have been controversial for Celsus to admit, and therefore it would not have been useful for Origen to say. But one thing that Josephus does say is he says that in the Testimonium, he says that Jesus worked paradoxa, paranormal deeds, and that is the same word that Celsus uses to say that Jesus worked paradoxa by magic. That's what Celsus says. So he would have been playing right into Celsus's hands if he had quoted this passage.
Yes.
So therefore, there's different kinds of arguments from silence. There are some very strong arguments from silence, but there's also very, very weak arguments from silence. If I walk into a room and I glance around and I say there's no bugs in this room, that's a weak argument from silence. Clearly, there could still be bugs hiding somewhere. But if I say there's not an elephant in this room, then that's probably a strong argument from silence. It's hard for an elephant to hide. You would expect me to notice that. So I think this is an example of a weak argument from silence. That there's many reasons why Origen would not have wanted to quote from the passage. And the next writer after Origen, Eusebius of Caesarea, he does quote from the passage several times. And he's actually one of my sort of case studies because he's clearly a little bothered by the passage. He quotes from it 3 times, but all he ever does with it is to argue for the chronological placement of Jesus's ministry, that he's like, look, he ministered under Pontius Pilate. And then he also points out that Jesus had many disciples, according to Josephus. And this just is mind-boggling. I mean, if Eusebius is quoting this passage multiple times, and he doesn't point out that Jesus is the Christ, that he was raised from the dead, that he fulfilled prophecy. I mean, clearly Eusebius is reading this passage differently than we are. And I think this is actually proven by his quotations and comments on the passage, because twice he very quickly pivots after quoting the passage to rebut those who argue that Jesus worked paradoxa by magic, like a sorcerer would. Clearly, Eusebius knows that people can read this passage and take away some negative implications of Jesus, and he wants to answer that.
Yeah, excellent. Now, we want to make a bridge over to part 2 because we want to talk about, both of these major sections of your book are so compelling. You mentioned a little bit earlier about this phrase that Josephus used, the first men among us. So there's a couple things about that. One is what does Josephus mean when he uses that phraseology outside of this passage? And so when we think about the first men among us, we then bridge over to his familiarity with the power structures of Israel and Jerusalem in the first century. And that's where we get into some intriguing connections. The question is, did Josephus have some familiarity with people possibly involved with Jesus's trial? That's a very there's a provocative question, but you delve into it in great detail. So give us a little intro to that.
I should say, first of all, that when I submitted my book for publication with Oxford, it was only part 1 and some appendices. And that was my intent. It was just going to be about the authenticity of the Testimonium. And the book was accepted for publication. And then when I was revising it, I thought, I should, in my conclusion, I should write a few paragraphs about where Josephus received his information about Jesus. And that led me down some amazing paths, totally unexpected. And I ended up writing an entire part 2 of the book. It had to go back through peer review because I added so much material to the book, because what I found was extraordinary. And it all began with that phrase, the first men. Josephus, in the Testimonium Flavianum, he says that the first men accused Jesus before Pontius Pilate. And I was sitting there reading that phrase for the 1,000th time, and some little tickle in my mind told me, where have I seen that phrase before? The first men. That sounds really familiar to me. And I went culling through databases, and I realized the reason why it reminded me of something is because Josephus uses the same term in his autobiography. Josephus wrote an autobiography. This is why we know so much about him. And in it, he says that in 51 or 52 AD, in his words, he says, I began continually meeting with the first men in Jerusalem. And then as the autobiography goes on, he does keep meeting with these first men. And I thought, my goodness, if in 51 or 52 AD, Josephus is meeting with the first men of Jerusalem, and if Josephus tells us that 20 years previously, in 30 or 33 AD, Jesus was crucified at the behest of the first men, maybe Josephus knew some of these guys.
Yes.
Maybe he knew people who were part of the trial of Jesus. That would give Josephus extraordinary access to information about Jesus, information derived not from Christian sources, but from the enemies of Jesus. It would make what Josephus has to say of enormous historical worth. So I started trying to nail these things down. And one other thing I noticed is that Josephus doesn't just say it was the first men who accused Jesus. He says it was the first men among us. And that phrase among us, Josephus also deploys many times, about 50 other times. And if you look at every single instance of this phrase, something interesting emerges. The question is, what does he mean by the phrase among us? Does he just mean among the Jews? Is this just an ethnic phrase to refer to the Jews in general? So it was the first men among the Jews. It's synonymous with that phrase. Or is Josephus using this phrase to give a note of personal familiarity, to tag a subject as one in which he is personally familiar? And to answer that question, we have to look at every single instance of this phrase among us being used by Josephus. He uses it 50 times. And in every single case, Josephus definitely knew the subject he is talking about. There's 2 or 3 instances where we can't prove that he had direct familiarity, but it seems very, very likely. And that's extraordinary because remember that Josephus is writing history, most of which he was not around for. So there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of instances where he could have used the term among us to mark a subject for which he had no personal experience with. If he's talking about the times of the Jewish kings or the times of the Babylonian exile or any number of things and all the hundreds of years of history he covers, he could have used the phrase for that, but he doesn't. And I argue, therefore, that this appears to be a note of personal familiarity. He's trying to show that he was directly familiar. He had some sort of personal acquaintance with the subject. And so that's another argument that he knew some of these guys, some of these first men, the first men among us. And I should pause, Henry, and tell you that Steve Mason, he was the one who wrote that 25-page review article of my book. This is one part where he's very critical of me. He does not buy this argument. And what he says is he thinks it's an ethnic phrase. It's just referring to Jews. And his argument is actually a good one. He says, if you look at how Josephus begins and concludes his books, he will talk about this is what the Greeks and Romans do, and this is what happens among us, as in Jews. Right. And he's clearly using it as an ethnic marker.
Yeah.
And I actually think Steve Mason is correct about that. With a major qualification. And the major qualification is, I do think that it's not that the term only refers to a personal marker. It can be an ethnic marker as well, but it's one that has a personal note of familiarity. And in those instances that Dr. Mason has pointed out, my response to that would be that, yes, Josephus does use this apparently as an ethnic marker in these instances, but in those instances, he also goes on directly afterwards to describe how he himself was familiar with these things. So I think that both things are going on in those opening and closing marker statements in his book. Either way, even if we dismiss the phrase among us, and when we just say it's just an ethnic marker, the phrase first men still stands. That Josephus says it was the first men who had Jesus crucified, and then 20 years later he says that he knew the first men. And that is a close relationship. And in my book, I go on to try and track down who some of these first men might have been, to see if we can actually put a name to some of these gentlemen.
Yeah. That's good. You're interacting with the critique, because then you can just sort of refine that further. It seems to me, like with all language, that context helps also drive the meaning of syntax and vocabulary. I mean, obviously there's a restriction. The vocabulary and syntax creates some restriction, but then context illuminates that, right? We don't use language. I'm not accusing Dr. Mason of this, but we don't use language that atomistically, atom, A-T-O-M, like where we atomize the word so much. words are always given in a context. And so it seems to me here, even in the TF, that there's a context going on here, like just a sense of familiarity, especially because of this whole thing with Pilate being mentioned. There's a lot of particulars there, but maybe that's a side note. So you talk about a lot of different people, historical figures, the Herodian dynasty, the people connected to the rabbis, Hillel, also the priestly power structure in Jerusalem. So, who would you like to start with? I'll let you choose what character you would like to begin with.
One thing that we have to keep in mind in this chapter, so this is chapter 6 in my book, that I'm doing two different things. One is I'm trying to figure out the names of some of those first men who might have been at the trial of Jesus, whom Josephus may have known directly. The second thing, though, I'm doing is just simply looking at Josephus's social network, because it could be that he didn't know anyone who was actually at the trial, but he knew people who knew Jesus otherwise. Obviously, you could know a lot about Jesus and still not be at his trial. You could have met him or had debates with him or any number of things.
Yes.
So I do both, where I'm trying to track down Josephus's potential sources of information about Jesus. Turns out he knows an extraordinary number of people who are embedded in first century Jerusalem and Galilee who would have been well apprised about Jesus of Nazareth. Let's start with the Herodians. The Herodians are the royal dynasty, the last royal house of the Jews. Although some of them, maybe were only half Jewish, that's a debate amongst people of how Jewish were they. But there are names. Let's start with names of people who your listeners might recognize. If you read the book of Acts, Paul stands before trial in the later chapters of Acts before Herod Agrippa II. And Herod Agrippa supervises the trial of the Apostle Paul. Turns out that Josephus knows Herod Agrippa II directly. They exchange 62 letters. Herod Agrippa calls Josephus my dearest friend. He says, Josephus, when you come to visit me, I will make known to you, or I will tell you matters which are not generally known. So Josephus knows a man who supervised the trial of the Apostle Paul.
Yeah.
He also, Josephus, knows other members of the Herodians. That girl, the nameless girl who dances for the head of John the Baptist, the daughter of Herodias. Josephus tells us her name. Her name was Salome. And he also tells us she went on to marry a gentleman named Aristobulus, who was another Herodian. The Herodians, I say in my book, they're less a family tree and more a family circle, because all the cousins are marrying each other and the uncles are marrying nieces and nephews repeatedly. Like Herodias marries her uncle, divorces him, marries her other uncle, divorces him, and then has her daughter marry her other uncle. So it gets all complicated. And I show in the book that Salome, that girl, lived a very long time. We have coins featuring her in 68 AD as still queen. And her husband lived to the 90s. We don't know how long she lived. We know she made it at least to 68. Josephus very easily could have known her directly, the girl who danced for the head of John the Baptist. But more likely, we know that he knew her son. So he knows the son of the woman who danced for the head of John the Baptist. And remember, in the Gospels, when John was in prison before his execution, that her father, Salome's father or stepfather, would call for John to preach. So she could easily have heard all sorts of sermons by John the Baptist. Of course, John would have preached about Jesus. So that's another a very interesting connection. Another one is Josephus's commander in the Jewish war. His name was Ananus II. He was the supreme commander, and Josephus tells us that he had James, the brother of Jesus, executed. So here again, we have another acquaintance of Josephus who put an apostle of Jesus on trial. Herod Agrippa did for Paul. Ananus II did it for James, the brother of Jesus. Now, in some ways, this is just scratching at the surface, because we still haven't actually gotten to Jesus himself. And For that, we can go to similar sources. Josephus tells us that he knew a man named Simon. Simon was the head of the Sanhedrin in the 60s. And Josephus tells us, and also the Jewish traditions found in the Mishnah and the Tosefta and the Talmud say the same thing, that Simon's father was also head of the Sanhedrin, and his name was Gamaliel, Rabbi Gamaliel. And this is the Rabbi Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5 or 6 who puts the apostles on trial, or who is at the trial of the apostles. And in this trial, Peter says, you murdered Jesus. And Gamaliel is head of the Sanhedrin, according to Jewish tradition, and he responds to this accusation. And what this means is that he seems to be implicated in the trial of Jesus. He also, being head of the Sanhedrin, would have been at the Sanhedrin trial of Jesus. In Sanhedrin law, the Tractate Sanhedrin, it says that for a trial of a false prophet, which is what Jesus was accused of being, that all the Sanhedrin members had to attend the trial. So Gamaliel would have been there. That means that Josephus knows Gamaliel's son. It means that Josephus knows the son of the head of the Sanhedrin who had Jesus crucified. And this man went on to become head of the Sanhedrin and put the apostles on trial. This is the same Sanhedrin that had James, the brother of Jesus, killed. It's the same Sanhedrin that probably would have put Paul on trial in Acts. So Josephus has extraordinary connections to the early Jesus movement. There's more, though. Remember, I mentioned Josephus's commander, Ananus II. This is the man who put James, the brother of Jesus, on trial and had him executed. Well, Ananus II is famous for another reason as well. It turns out that Ananus II, Josephus's commander, was the brother-in-law of the high priest Caiaphas and the son of the high priest Annas. And if you read the Gospels, it's the high priest Caiaphas who puts Jesus on trial. And it's the high priest Annas who's the high priest emeritus. He's the power behind the throne.
Yes.
And he also is pulling the strings to get Jesus on trial. This means Josephus knows this another son of another key Jewish figure who put Jesus on trial, the high priest, and he also knows Gamaliel, or the son of Gamaliel, the head of the Sanhedrin. So he has all sorts of connections via the sons of these people. And I go over several other candidates. But the question, of course, I hope your listeners are asking is, but did he know anyone who actually was at the trial? I think I can clearly show that he knew people whose fathers were at the trial, and that these were very significant sons. One went on to become head of the Sanhedrin, the other went on to become high priest and commander of the Jewish army. So the question of did Josephus actually know individuals there? I think the answer is yes. And that's because if we focus on Josephus's commander, Ananus II, he was also high priest, and his father was Annas, the high priest who put Jesus on trial. His brother was brother-in-law was Caiaphas. Josephus tells us that Ananus II was extremely old in 68 AD. He says he was the oldest of the high priests. He says that twice. And in Ananus' speech, his final speech before he's murdered, in around 69 AD, Ananus says, he talks about his old age. And I don't have to tell your listeners that to be the oldest of the high priests means you're pretty old.
Yes,
you don't become the oldest of the chief priests by being a young man. And we have other ways of testing this. Ananus II had a brother, and his brother was high priest 50 years before he was.
Wow.
That is a long time.
Very long time.
And his father, Annas, the one who's mentioned in the Gospels, he was high priest 60 years before he was. So he's an old guy in 68 AD.
Certainly.
And what that means is that he would have been in his 30s or 40s when Jesus was put on trial. He clearly was old enough to be there. And we know the Gospels tell us that all the chief priests were present at the trial of Jesus. If we trust the Gospels, that means that Ananus II would have been there at the trial. Josephus, his commander, would have been there. But we do have another piece of evidence. And in my book, I point out that Jesus, of course, was arrested on the evening of Passover. That's when he was brought to the high priests for interrogation. And Passover law was very clear. This is that on the Passover, faithful Jews were supposed to travel to Jerusalem. They're supposed to share a lamb, not just with their family, but they're supposed to share a lamb in the house of their familial patriarch. And they're supposed to then spend the night in the house of their familial patriarch. And this is to reenact that first Passover where you gathered in the house of your family patriarch and the destroyer passed over the tents of the Jewish people. And if they put blood on the doorpost, the lintel, then the destroyer would pass over. So you weren't supposed to leave the house. You're supposed to sleep and spend the night in the house. So they reenact this. They go to Jerusalem, they get a lamb, they eat the lamb in the house of their patriarch, and then they spend the night. What that means is that on the evening of Passover, Jesus was brought to the house of the high priests, Annas, and then to the house of Caiaphas for trial. And what this means is that Josephus, his commander, as son of Annas, was required to be in his father's house on the evening of Passover, exactly where and exactly when Jesus was brought there. So I submit that when Josephus said it was the first men among us who accused Jesus, he's talking about his own commander, Ananus II. And he knew this man directly.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that web of information. I mean, it's laid out very well in the book where people can kind of unpack everything that you just said. It really is an extraordinary thing. This is what goes back to what I said at the beginning and you alluded to, is the extraordinary life of Josephus. I mean, the people that he knew that either had first or direct hand information, as you just alluded to, all this whole network. And in the book too, you also bring up the point of his parents would have been alive right around the time of the events of Jesus. Josephus was stationed in the Galilee. No doubt that he heard about the gospel from people there who had been converted one way or the other, right? I mean, he's just swimming in a context of being so familiar with the events that had just occurred. It also points us to the authenticity of the Gospels themselves. They kind of work hand in hand, right? How did the Gospel authors know these particular pieces of information about these offices and so forth, right? In the old days, they used to say, especially John, it was written in the 2nd century or late in the 1st century, and those theories have been blown up by archaeology and historical studies. But they work. My point is they work hand in hand with one another. So back to Steve Mason's critique of the grammar of first men among us. I see your point now that even if that's a more broad term, you're not hanging the whole argument on that because of all of this other network of information and acquaintance that Josephus had.
Precisely, exactly.
So have skeptical arguments, or maybe that's not fair, academic critiques, have they tried to say, this whole network of connection here is a bridge too far, or I don't see it, or whether have you seen any of that, Tom, and or people silent on the subject?
Thus far, they've been pretty silent. A review came out by Paul Foster. It was a very short review, one of the 3 that's come out, and all he says about part 2 is he says that just because Josephus knew people who knew Jesus doesn't mean that Josephus got his information from those people. That's not the same thing. Those are 2 different things. And he's right about that, but I thought that critique was heartening because he seems to kind of acknowledge that Josephus maybe did know some people who knew Jesus.
Yeah.
And he doesn't, of course, embrace that openly. But
Right.
other critiques have been that I trust the Gospels too much, that I take the Gospels too seriously as historical pieces of evidence, especially about the trial of Jesus. I respond to this in my book. In my book, I do two things. One is that I say that I'll frequently say things like, if we trust Luke, then this would be the case. So I don't. I try to treat the Gospels just like any piece of ancient literature.
Sure.
And I think I do that fairly in the book. I want to be careful not to, often skeptical scholars will critique Christians as treating the Gospels as sort of this canonical sacred thing that can never be wrong. But of course, they treat the Gospels as this sort of anti-canon that must be incorrect, instead of just treating it like ancient literature and looking at what it says.
Yes.
Regarding the trial of Jesus, people have critiqued, this is in presentations I've given and what I've heard from emails and things. They've critiqued my reconstruction of the trial of Jesus. The going notion amongst certain skeptical scholars is that the trial of Jesus in the Gospels is hopelessly contradictory, and the Gospels contradict themselves, and they also contradict the Sanhedrin protocols listed in the Mishnah and the Talmud. And in my book, though, I show that I don't think that's the case. I think that they actually agree, the gospel accounts agree with each other, and that they agree with the Mishnah protocols of what the stipulations of what the Sanhedrin was supposed to do remarkably well. I don't think there are serious contradictions there. And it doesn't mean that we necessarily know every single thing that happened during the trial, but I think we can be assured that the trial was very much as the gospel accounts lay out, and in part because they actually do seem to follow the Sanhedrin stipulations in the Mishnah and Talmud. I'll give you some examples. The Mishnah says that for a trial of a false prophet, that the entire Sanhedrin is to be present. You can't just have a subset. And what do the Gospels say? They say the entire Sanhedrin is present. They're very, very clear. They say that the high priest was to act as a judge. That exactly seems like what's happening with Caiaphas, tearing his robes and demanding evidence and things. Says that for a trial, you're supposed to bring forth witnesses, which is exactly what happens. Witnesses are brought forward in the Gospels. The Mishnah says that these witnesses are supposed to be tested and examined. And that seems to be what happens, because the Gospels say that their testimony did not agree. And because of that, the high priest just starts to interrogate Jesus directly, because the testimony from these witnesses isn't holding up to scrutiny. The stipulations say that the crucifixion or the execution of the offender is supposed to take place outside the city, which happens with Jesus, that ideally this execution is supposed to take place on a pilgrimage feast. And that's so that the execution is as public as possible, that as Jews are entering Jerusalem, they see this executed person. And there's a warning there. That's exactly what happens with Jesus. Exactly what happens with him. So, you start adding these things together, and it just strikes me as enormously corroborative evidence that the trial of Jesus is basically what occurred. Josephus tells us that the Jews did not have power of capital punishment, and the Gospels reflect that they've got to go to Pilate to actually carry this out. The tensions that scholars will say, they'll say, well, the Mishnah says that for a capital trial, you're not allowed to begin and end the trial on the same day, and you're not allowed to have the trial at night. Now, the issue with that, though, is if you read the Gospels carefully, there is another gathering of the Sanhedrin that takes place earlier in the week where they decide to try and put Jesus to death. So it's very possible that was the beginning of the trial. a few days later. And then you'll notice that this nighttime trial of Jesus that is supposedly illegal, there's a couple things to say about that. One is that we do know that there were some Sanhedrin stipulations that could be jettisoned in extreme circumstances. This could be one of them. But I think a better response is that if you read the gospel accounts, Jesus has this nighttime trial, but then what happens in the morning? The Sanhedrin quickly comes together and they do another trial.
Yes. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it seems to be that that's the official kind of daytime pro forma trial that was probably just a rubber stamp to make sure that they did everything appropriately. So I think that trial narratives follow the Sanhedrin tractates of the Mishnah extremely well. I actually find that they're very corroborative and solidify what the Gospels say.
That's excellent. That's good. Yeah, there's always going to be this overlap with other areas of dispute, right? So you're effectively in your argument making assumptions about the reliability of the Gospels, but that's not just an ad hoc assumption. Like there's volumes of scholarship that back that up. Your goal in the book is not to advance the authenticity of the Gospels, right? So you can only do so much in an argument. So that it is interesting, but where these things touch and where you're able to explore them, it draws out the reliability of the Gospels, the authenticity, the eyewitness testimony, the details, all that other kind of thing. Just the whole thing with the power structure of Jerusalem and how that matches Josephus and other sources. It's actually quite extraordinary. Obviously, it speaks of eyewitness testimony, first century authorship of the text, all those kind of things. Well, Tom, this has been a tour de force, my friend. You've just done a wonderful job of laying out this material. My book is filled with notes, and I have yellow sticky notes sticking out the top all over the place for future reference. This is an important work that you've done here, and here at Digging for Truth and the Ministry of ABR, we're really grateful for having this resource at our fingertips, and we're looking forward to continuing to talk about it. I want to allow you to sort of provide us with a sort of a summary in any way that you would like to. I know it's hard to sum up so much academic work in a short way, but I want to give you the liberty to do that, Tom.
I would say just what the title of the book is, Josephus and Jesus, New Evidence for the One Called Christ. I believe this book furnishes new evidence for the Jesus of history. And the evidence says that he did work miracles and that the disciples did believe that on the third day, Jesus was resurrected. And this seems to come from a first century non-Christian Jewish historian named Josephus, who knew the enemies of Jesus personally. And if your listeners are interested, they can sign up for a newsletter on the book website. The book is being sponsored by the Institute for Christian Reflection. They can also visit that to see if they'd like to support that institution as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Tom. I appreciate you being on the program again, and hopefully we'll be able to get together again, either for the second edition or maybe some other subject that we'd love to cover together. Appreciate it, man. Thanks for your hard work.
Thank you so much, Henry.
Make sure, if you want to dive deeper, that you check out josephusandjesus.com, where you can get a copy of Dr. Schmidt's book. And if you want to watch him on Digging for Truth TV, we've got a link to it for you in the show notes. And that's all we have for today. Until next time.
Digging for Truth is a presentation of the Associates for Biblical Research. To find out more about ABR, just go to BibleArchaeology.org.